Welcome to this last session of the Bergen Exchanges 2020. The topic of this roundtable is science in climate litigation, epistemic communities at work. And this follows on from the last session where Cesar Rodriguez-Garavito introduced us to climate litigation. Sometimes expert networks succeed in influencing policies and practices, including international treaties. One pathway to influence is through the courts. There are now almost 1,600 climate change cases worldwide, and expert networks or epistemic communities play a crucial role in supporting lawyers and NGOs in mobilizing science for climate justice. In this roundtable, we will learn more about how these networks of knowledge work, their potential, and the challenges. We are lucky to have a wonderful team of experts gathered here in Bergen and on Zoom. Next to me, here in Bergen, is Kiki Kleiven from the Department of Earth Science at the University of Bergen and the Bjerknes Center for Climate Research, and one of Norway's most profiled climate scientists. We also have the young Rubio Dupont, who recently obtained his PhD from the University of Melbourne on equity principles to mitigate global warming. And his research seeks to derive national emissions trajectories and assess the ambition of current climate pledges under the UNFCCC. Prior to his PhD, he studied theoretical physics, climate, ocean, and atmospheric science. So a broad range of competence. With us on Zoom, we have Cesar Rodriguez-Garavito, who most of you already met, legal scholar and sociologist from the NYU School of Law. And last, but certainly not least, we have Randall Abate with us from the US. He is professor of marine and environmental law and policy, and also a professor in the Department of Political Science and Sociology at Monmouth University in New Jersey, where he also serves as the director of the Institute for Global Understanding. He has published extensively in the fields of domestic and international environmental law, climate justice, constitutional law, and animal law. And he has taught not only in law schools across the US, but literally across the globe. We are extremely lucky to have him with us to introduce us to the role of epistemic communities in climate litigation. So Randall, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Siri, and I'm delighted to be here as part of this panel. It's an honor. And I thoroughly enjoyed the inspiring and comprehensive remarks that Cesar shared to lead up to this presentation. I'm grateful for this invitation from the Center for Law and Social Transformation at Bergen. And I wanted to share some observations about the role of climate science in climate litigation, and a theme that it is absolutely necessary for successful climate litigation, but not sufficient, in that there are many other legal and social and political hurdles involved in successful climate litigation, and I'll go through some of those successes and challenges that have been encountered in this space. And I wanted to start by this initial challenge of why something so conclusive and well established as climate science is, it remains controversial, not something that is just accepted as true, as we've seen in other environmental contexts where science supported regulation and litigation. And then I want to go through some examples, building on some of what Cesar shared with us, of cases where climate science was used as a foundation for advocating for enhanced government stewardship, and also how it was a platform for other legal theories such as human rights in the government context, and then also how climate science has been used in private sector litigation as a way of advancing the plaintiffs' theories there. And then just briefly address some remaining challenges with the use of climate science in litigation. So the climate science as controversy is something that remains a challenge for climate science. And there are several realities here. First and foremost, climate science is different from environmental science that has supported other environmental litigation in many ways because it's more complex, in the sense that it has to overcome this background narrative that other contexts don't have. And that is, we've seen for centuries in the planet's history, natural variations in climate. So climate science has to provide an added dimension to this understanding that human activity and the extent of human activity and how rapidly human activity has caused climate change is something that needs to overcome that backdrop of existing climate science with respect to the natural variation. And of course, that is one piece of what climate denial science has latched onto, that there is this sense of this is just another instance of that natural variation, which is certainly not true based on what we know from climate science, but nonetheless an argument that continues to be made. And also with respect to complexity, it's just harder and to see, and it's less palpable when we think about effects of climate change as compared to something more straightforward like water pollution or air pollution. So in compounding that initial scientific dimension is the notion of economics and how expensive it is to effectively regulate climate change. That's another reason for the pushback on the use of climate science to achieve effective regulation and litigation. And then, of course, there's the political domain. Cesar referenced that sense of antagonism that we see from the US and Brazil and other nations that are just unwelcoming to the idea of making a political commitment, an economic commitment to addressing climate change effectively. And ultimately, all of these realities fueled the climate denial movement, which is alive and well in the US and elsewhere, Australia, UK, and essentially supported by the fossil fuel industry to cast doubt on climate science, essentially focus on the insufficient level of certainty and try to postpone the need to regulate, which is in fact urgent and an emergency. And last but not least, there's a human nature dimension to all of this. That is, because these impacts are not as readily apparent to most humans in their daily lives compared to something like land-based pollution or water pollution, there's that sense of it's off in the future. It's not as immediate and necessary as other forms of regulation and other ways of engaging our economic outlay. And just at a very basic level in human nature, we want to convince ourselves that everything's going to be okay. So climate science overwhelms us in many ways with a sense of looming catastrophe. And our initial gut reaction is to find a way to think we're going to be okay because we have this strong survival instinct, and we don't want to hear that the near term is catastrophic. And we're very bad at responding to long-term, slow onset crises for that reason. It's just contrary to human nature to do well with that sort of regulation. So here are two examples. Cesar did a great job outlining the Urgenda case, and so I'll spend a little more time with Massachusetts v. EPA, which is considered to be one of the most significant initial early stage climate litigation cases, and how essential climate science was in laying the foundation for that case to succeed the way it did. A case brought by Massachusetts and many other states alleging injury on the basis of a loss of coastal land on its shore, and ultimately the causal link between EPA's failure to regulate a narrow slice of global climate change contributions. Basically, it was only carbon dioxide emissions from new automobiles. To link that failure to regulate by one US agency to the attenuated effect of loss of coastal land in Massachusetts. Even optimistic environmentalists would argue that, that's an attenuated connection, a valid one, certainly, but an attenuated one. And it was the strength of the climate science in that case that was able to establish that injury, the loss of coastal land from sea level rise, as a palpable injury for the state to allege, and also support that causal link from the failure to regulate that narrow class of emissions that contribute to climate change, and that loss of coastal land in Massachusetts. So that was very important to establish this legal theory, which is connected to the Urgenda case, that the climate science supported this notion of the state's stewardship responsibility. And in this case, it was called special solicitude, the idea that the state has this responsibility to protect its citizens and its territory from the threat of sea level rise on its coasts. And so in the Urgenda case, a similar reality, but it was extended into a new domain. Again, climate science, as Cesar noted, was used to ratchet up as an argument that the Netherlands needed to ratchet up its ambition in addressing climate change to be consistent with what the climate science was telling us. And that was part of the stewardship piece of the analysis in that case, but it also was related to how that failure to be an effective steward ultimately could be litigated on the basis of human rights impacts. And that was a reality that we also saw in the Juliana case, as Cesar briefly alluded to, the idea that there was an argument for enhanced government stewardship, this idea of an atmospheric trust, and also the notion of constitutional rights being violated, as alleged in that case by the youth plaintiffs, based on this notion of a due process clause right to a stable climate. And that case is still in the works, moving forward, being appealed from the initial Ninth Circuit panel dismissal of that case earlier this year. So on the notion of the private sector, similarly, we see climate science building the case for the opportunity to succeed in this line of cases. So Cesar mentioned the climate majors petition and the science behind that, this desire to connect a very short list of multinational actors, in that case the carbon majors, and just fewer than 20 actors, and their significant contribution to climate change, and trying to attribute their action and inaction to those harms. And in that case, it was human rights that were considered as the impacts before the Philippines Human Rights Commission. There's a line of cases going on now in the US that are building on that science, and the science has gotten stronger over these 5 years that it's been pursued in these cases. And now in the US, we're looking at a list of 88 multinational corporations that are responsible for 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite daunting when you think about it, and how there's a need to assign responsibility for those actors because they are essentially continuing to profit and operate without the necessary accountability that should be attached. And on that notion of government stewardship, there is a reality going on now that states, counties, cities in their stewardship capacities are suing these fossil fuel companies to seek damages for the climate adaptation costs, the massive climate adaptation costs and resilience costs that these governmental entities are facing. And those costs would fall on the shoulders of the taxpayers if not for these lawsuits. If these lawsuits succeed, then we're going to see the fossil fuel industry paying their fair share through this attribution science, instead of all of those costs falling on the taxpayers' shoulders. And so climate attribution science is very powerful and is showing some promise here, not just because of the strength of the science, but also because these cases are now largely proceeding in state court rather than federal court, and that is a big advantage in terms of the remedies and the legal theories at issue in these cases. And I wanted to conclude briefly on picking up on some of Cesar's other points, in that causation is a major hurdle in these cases. Just because the science is strong, just because these legal theories are tight, there are still challenges about that high standard of causation at trial and linking these realities on a global basis to local impacts, and the idea of how to apportion those damages across these different contributors. Those are difficult but not impossible challenges that we'll see play out in these cases. And also, more basically, we've seen this in many of these climate change cases, this idea about the courts and their role in climate change regulation, that we all can acknowledge that we're not going to solve the climate crisis one case at a time in our court system, but ultimately there's an argument that all of climate regulation is really better suited for the legislatures, the regulatory agencies, the executive branch, and not for the courts. They are not the experts. They are not appropriately delegated that responsibility in a constitutional democracy like the US, the argument goes. And yet these cases are very important to get us where we ought to be, which is demanding the regulation from those legislative and regulatory bodies. And the courts, these cases are a vehicle to help us get to those outcomes, the top-down regulation that we need. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Randall, for this quick but very informative tour of the role of science in climate litigation. I want to just give the word to Jan to take over and comment and continue.
Thank you. Yeah, I think both presentations before were very interesting, and I would like to branch out, but perhaps on some of the terms that were used, especially with respect to how science is considered by court or by legal practitioners, and how attribution is understood. And so it feels that science is this tool that will give precise answers as to how we can attribute the responsibility from an actor onto the damages felt by another agent. And it's not that simple, and it asks several questions. So I think part of the question is how to attribute events to climate change. And that's one field. And then how to attribute climate change to a particular agent. So that can be a company or a government. And then there's the question that was referred to as fair share. How do you attribute the responsibility to either correct or prevent specific climate change events that were in the past or are in the future to an agent or a company or a country? And to guide us on that, there are the documents that courts like to use, and there's the IPCC reports, and that's perhaps the documents that are the most used because they're commonly accepted. They're usually signed off by countries, usually all countries, and so that makes them very usable proof by courts, and the judges feel confident relying on those documents. But it's not everything there is, and because they're approved by governments, they give very limited indications onto either national responsibility or the responsibility of certain actors. So when we're touching on the responsibility of companies, for instance, this would not be directly included in IPCC reports or UN treaties. So there is a whole body of science also acting, and that's the work I've been doing. So either working on publishing studies that can also advise on how to use these conventions, but doing also the step that can be used for courts of, given the global goals, so the Paris Agreement, the net zero goal, or staying below 2 degrees, what is the responsibility of each country? How much should each country be doing? And there we can apply scientific methods, quantitative methods, but there's also an interpretation of what is fair. Do we share the responsibility across countries based on their historical responsibility, based on their capability? And so I've worked on a few of the cases that were mentioned. I also advised the Urgenda case, for instance, and they took fairness principles and a range of them from the IPCC to define what was the minimal possible responsibility of the Dutch government. And that's how they said, at minimum, you should do that. So I worked on advising a few of those cases against a few European and Asian countries. And there's also a case that was filed against Total in January. And there it's, Total is an oil company. And there it's also a different question, because there's no inherent responsibility for a company to leave some, let's say, pollution space or emission space to another. So even if we say that oil should be phased out at some point, by then, how much should each company get? And so how can you make an argument for limiting emissions by a company? Can it rely on possible future negative emissions? So what I just wanted to point out is that these science questions can also be tweaked, and there's many arguments to make, and it's not always possible to have a very clear answer to a question that seems simple, but it can also bring a lot of interesting argument in the cases we can make against governments or companies.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I remember the first time I started to work a little bit with climate scientists, one of their frustrations was that we've told the politicians what they need to do, that they need to act, and nothing is happening. And of course, this has changed in the past decade. But from the perspective of a climate scientist, Kiki, what is your angle and perspective on this, what we're seeing now?
Well, things are really, I mean, I'm more optimistic in terms of the knowledge on political level in society now than when I started out. You know, it's sort of 20 years from now, I was younger and much more optimistic. I had this like faith. I had a really big faith that people had the necessary knowledge and the necessary tools to make the good decisions. I was very optimistic, and I realized that for a long time that there was a complete lack of capacity. There was lack of knowledge, and there was a lack of translation of science into, how do you say, like almost like popular science language or political language. I can see that in order for us to really communicate work and knowledge that could be used legally, that could be used to make the right political decision, there was a huge void. And I think also the way that the climate now, I mean, if you look at how IPCC basically present their research, it's very different from how it was. Now it's research that could be used. It's research that could go straight into political discussion and negotiations. But I'm still amazed of, for instance, based on the Norwegian lawsuits, how much we have to work with sort of catalyzing the relevant knowledge, how much we still have to sort of build up teams to build up the legal knowledge. There was that was a huge void. I see that from that. I'm a natural scientist, and because of we work with it much more transdisciplinary, I know a lot from the social science point of view, the more human rights point of view. But when we came to the legal language and the legal, how do you say, translation of climate science, that was a huge challenge, and I see it still ongoing. And I also see that a lot of the sort of litigation relevant research, from my point of view, I would think that would be the hardcore natural sciences. But there's something missing. It's missing here in Norway, and it's missing in a lot of relevant fields. That's the evidence from the real live lived experiences from communities who live with climate change. And you brought up in the introduction to this theme also the gender perspective. I spent a lot of time reading about specifically how women are now hurt so much more from the pandemic ruining a lot of the good planning in climate adaptation. A lot of things are just broken down now, and women and children are hurt much more. So that is also a perspective that I think we have to bring into account. So there are part of the research field still missing in this.
Very, very interesting. So it's not only about the hard natural sciences, down to integrating.
Yeah.
Transdisciplinary.
Absolutely.
And of course, I forget to unmute, but very, very interesting. Thanks a lot. Cesar, from your perspective as a litigator and as a theorist, of litigation. What is your perspective on the relationship between science and litigation? I think you should be on. Yes, good.
I think the connection is absolutely crucial, as has been made clear in this panel, and as many cases, ongoing lawsuits have shown. As I mentioned in my presentation, I think it was convergence of the more explicit framing of the human impacts of climate change that became visible in IPCC reports, and the 2018 1.5 degrees report was particularly helpful in that regard, and the ongoing mobilization of young people, of indigenous people, of environmental and human rights activists around the world, that convergence is behind some of the most interesting, exciting, and promising litigation efforts. From the point of view of the cases that I've studied around the world, I would highlight two things. The first one is precisely going back to the question that was raised after my presentation and the comments in this panel, that going deeper into the impact of climate change on specific individuals and communities, especially particularly vulnerable communities, is key. And that's, I think, an encouraging development in some of the most interesting cases, promising cases. So the impact on young people has been front and center. I mean, I would not say that that's a group that has been left out of the attention in terms of lawsuits. For obvious reasons, young people have been front and center in those cases. There's about 19 cases around the world that have been filed on behalf or with young people, including an international case filed by Greta Thunberg and a number of young people from the most polluting countries that have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So that case is before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. What the boundaries there, I think, the challenges are more legal than scientific. Science can tell us that the impact will be a lot worse down the line for people who will be 50 in 2050 or so. But in the case of other populations, indigenous peoples, women, ethnic and racial discriminated groups, the pandemic has driven that point home, that the impact of the virus and the pandemic has been widely unequal across sectors, social, ethnic, racial, and so on. And I would add that lack of attention to those groups, it goes hand in hand with lack of attention to adaptation litigation. So over 90% of the cases argued on the basis of human rights arguments have focused on mitigation for good reasons. I mean, there needs to be a de-escalation of fossil fuel consumption and burning. But if you, from a theoretical and from a practical point of view, human rights arguments really lend themselves even better to litigating adaptation cases in which specific coastal communities, right, not just in the Pacific Islands, which are the particularly severely stricken sectors and populations, not just on the hundreds of millions of climate refugees that are forecast to leave their countries because of climate change, but also fishermen and fishing communities in around the world. The impact on women, on women's health, and that has the potential for very impactful, very meaningful, and participatory litigation. I'll end by saying that the one very clear line of work in litigation that's brought those 2 points of view together, meaning community mobilization, social movement litigation on the one hand, and scientists and litigators on the other side, is indigenous people's rights litigation in some parts of the world. So just recently, for example, a case before the Brazilian Supreme Court was on the impact of COVID in the Amazon, was brought to the court by the Indigenous Movement Association, with law-oriented organizations and with the support of scientists. And it is doctors, medical and health experts who oftentimes are the most proactive and the most decisive supporters of this type of litigation.
Thanks a lot, Cesar. Thanks a lot for those perspectives and insights. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience online or from people here. I think we'll just sort of include them in the discussion. If not, I have some questions to you, but just to allow so that people, if anybody want to comment, just let us know now. So because we don't have that much time left, but I wanted to ask one thing, which is, I mean, there are many things I'm interested in, but one issue that we haven't touched upon now is whether climate science can also help to expand the traditional anthropocentric concepts like human rights to also encompass nature and make the rights of nature enforceable against governments, but also companies. So we're seeing that we see that emerging. We see it, I mean, there are legal developments at the constitutional level in countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, sort of including rights of nature at constitutional level. We also see the litigation that you've been involved in, Cesar, and that I also referred to earlier, where the Amazon is granted legal personhood. But are these sort of, what is the role of science in sort of broadening the perspective on environmental protection or in climate litigation? Is that something that, do you have any thoughts on that? Anyone? Do you want to start, Kiki?
A quick one. I went back to the Norwegian lawsuit,
yes,
which was really about that the Norwegian government was opening up licenses in the Arctic.
Yeah.
So the lawsuit was really about paragraph 112.
Yes.
You know, in terms of like with changes there and hurting our rights to a diverse, wonderful nature and the future cost of generations for this to happen. But the focus was really on these licenses. But if you, I think as that law case now is moving up and the thinking about the Arctic is not just licenses. The Arctic is one of the most world's unique ecosystems with a right on its own. It consists of tiny building stones in an ecosystem, and any change, any pollution up there would have enormous consequences, enormous global consequences. And because not only will you get an oil spill will ruin the Arctic, but the emissions from even more oil, even more gas, will totally change and remove the ecosystem. So there's a sort of double whammy involved in allowing this exploration of the Arctic to move on. So I think to view some of these regions as rights on its own, Arctic naturally, Amazonas, those are big, but what about my local mire? What about the mini ecosystems that is being ruined just around the airport here in Bergen now, which has existed since the ice melted, with soil horizons that's been developed and nurtured by people for over 7,000 years. So if you really go into and try to bring it home, there's a lot of nature value just where you lived, and how can you put a price on somebody who worked and tilled the soil for 7,000 years and created unique environments?
So this is really interesting. So the climate science is one way of, or science more broadly, is a way of appreciating more the value of ecosystems in its own right, not only value for people, but value, inherent value. But how are these, and you were talking about that earlier, sort of, how is the translation of this sort of scientific knowledge and appreciation translated? Can this be translated into new legal mechanisms? I'm going to throw the ball to you, Cesar, because in a way that is what was done in the Amazon case to some extent.
Yes, beyond that particular case, I think that precisely let's take a kind of an ecosystemic view to the idea of rights of nature and look at, I love the allusion to the Arctic and to gardens, because it really brings down to earth and brings home the interdependence of different ecosystems and forms of livelihood around the world. And I think that for the purposes of litigation, one thing that I will say is that the idea of rights of nature needs to be hashed out much more carefully and much more detailed for it to hold and to stick in future litigation. So that's, I think that the concept is out there. It came very directly in the case of Ecuador from the cosmovision of indigenous peoples in the Amazon. I've had the opportunity to work with the Sarayaku people for a number of years, and they very effectively advocated the incorporation of the idea of the living jungle of good living that comes with an ecosystemic view of the world. The encouraging, but that's kind of a pending task. What to make of that? What to extract in terms of government duties, in terms of individual responsibilities, in terms of the responsibility of organizations and institutions. That's a fascinating task that I think needs to be tackled by both practitioners and by researchers. The one thing that I think has happened since those first pioneer cases and constitutional provisions is that there's a lot of interest in ecology and ways of looking at formerly separate entities of subjects of research in a much more holistic way. So, for example, I'm very encouraged by the way in which there's growing interest in medicine in the human biome, the gut, right? So seeing the body, the human body as an ecosystem, and also in seeing any biological unit as an ecosystem itself. You may have seen this debate about a beautiful book by Marilyn Sheldrake, a mycologist. The book is entitled Entangled Life. And his argument there is that biology is turning into ecology, that the basic unit of analysis for science, both natural and social, should be relationships, because no entity, either social or biological, and more importantly, socio-biological entities like human beings, exist in isolation from each other, as this virus has reminded us painfully.
Randall, did you want to come in on this as well?
Yes, thank you. This is something that is an issue near and dear to my heart. I completed a book project called Climate Change and the Voiceless last year, and this is very much the thesis of the book, at how science needs to remind us, as Cesar noted, that this interconnectedness principle is what's going to save us. That as humans, we've created this problem. This anthropocentric view to everything in our world has put us in this crisis, and we have to build resilience, and strong natural systems are part of the resilience to climate change threats. And also, we have a way of relying on science to help us understand what we can sustain as an interconnected system. So the principle of sustainable development is something that can be a reference point as a mandate rather than a mere aspiration. And there have been some very encouraging cases in that regard of late. One called the Gloucester Limited case in Australia, where where this approach of a carbon budget was used to determine what is in fact sustainable. A proposed coal mine was ultimately rejected on many grounds, one of which was that that projected emission from that proposed facility would cause the country to exceed its carbon budget. And many levels of development decisions could be subject to this lens, and that is relevant for both human and non-human sustainability, that we have to be very protective of what we are adding to this problem in all decisions moving forward, and that's going to help promote sustainability for humans and non-humans.
Thanks a lot, both Randall and Cesar. Very, very, very interesting. Did you want to comment on the same, on these issues as well?
Yeah, very briefly, I can only agree with what has been said before. And so I think having science to help showing the interconnectedness can help both inform on how law can be also expanded to have new engines, but also, yeah, on how to apply law, because you have all these proxies. So, for instance, the goal is to have a stable climate, or to stay below 2 degrees, or to have net zero emissions. But ultimately, this is not what you want. What you want is to avoid climate impacts, or to have sufferance or damages to the ecosystems. And I think science can help informing once these decisions are taken on the articulation with the ultimate services we're trying to preserve, and the ecosystem we're trying to preserve. And then there's an evolution coming from the dialogue between scientists and legal practitioners on how law can interpret all these causalities. And I think that's where the scientists can help informing.
Very, very interesting. And this, in a way, bridges to what I think will be my last question, because we don't have that much time. But it is, so this doesn't happen by itself. And of course, if you read the title with this roundtable, the sort of subtitle is Epistemic Communities at Work. And you're all part of this epistemic community, trying to make climate science relevant, trying to make climate science inform policy. You do it in many different ways, including through litigation. So what are the strategies? What are the ways in which this happens? What are the obstacles? So how do you do it? That's what I also want to know. And I think that's that's my last question. Who wants to start? I'll let you start, because you said that you informed the Uganda case, you've been advising. So how do you build this epistemic community? How does it operate?
Yeah. So I've been working on science that I think was directly relevant to the question of what is the budget of Australia, for instance, as Randall mentioned, or how much should each country do, was directly relevant. So I've been approached by legal practitioners, and that's how it started. And I was curious, and then we started to multiply interactions. And I think there's some of the scientific literature that helps that. There are general scientific journals such as, I don't know, Science, Nature, interdisciplinarity. Strangely enough, while a lot of scientists are working on the Paris Agreement, which is a legal document, the legal publications sort of stand out and don't really come into these scientific journals that are yet very interdisciplinary. So there's a little bit of a challenge here, I think, to reconcile, and that's where legal practitioners help solving this by directly approaching scientists, and the scientists that want to engage, such as like Kiki and myself and others, can do it, but it's not directly within your mandate as when you're working in academia to do this. And I think one of the challenges as well is, I think many scientists feel like it is their duty of reserve to not take part, as if they were taking side by bringing scientific information to a legal case. They're not necessarily aware of what they're risking on it. So I think that's one of the challenge. One practical is also different journals. Another one is different language. I think on attribution for an extreme event, you can say how much more likely is an event to happen with and without climate change. Can that be translated into a legal conversation as how responsible are you? And then should you pay that proportionality of the total cost? Like, how do you translate language from the scientific findings that are often just scientists trying to speak to each other to legal court. So I think there's many challenges, but it's very interesting, and I think it's only going to grow as a discussion.
Thank you, Jan. You were nodding vigorously.
I agree with what you're saying, and it's you meet, of course, you meet that once you stick your head out. You know, somebody wants to chop it off, and it's usually the guy next door or the girl next door, because you're advocating, you have opinions, and by going in and helping with litigation and really clearly you take a stand. You're not objective anymore as a scientist. And some will say that, is this really our job? And I would turn that around and say that it is so incredibly important that funding agencies and also private funders of science should support this part of being a scientist, that to really spread knowledge and help awareness. And I would also, something that I have done myself and I want to try to do more, is also increase the scientific community with non-scientists by doing community science, by involving, I'm here in Norway, I focused a lot on not the global sea level, but your local sea level. What is happening to your sea level? What is happening to your rain? What is happening to the acidification in your fjord? And to really take it home and have local people measure and get involved in collecting data has made them a lot more aware of that there's something out there that's global, but it's really actually impacting my local fjord. I see a lot of communities, especially indigenous communities that I know in the Arctic, are really on the forefront of this. And just very shortly, I just want to say, because I was impressed that I met some of the during the Arctic heavens, what do we call that thing every January? Arctic Frontiers meeting in Norway. There were representatives of some of the Inuit communities. And they said they were really tired of us scientists getting money from, say, Norway or Denmark or Alaska, US, to go to do research on them and what's happening around them. They said, give us the research money. We want to have the research fund, and then you can apply, because we know actually what research needs to be done. So there's a little aspect of that as well, which I think would kind of grow a broader knowledge.
So broaden the epistemic community.
Yeah.
Randall, now this will also be this is also the final closing. So your take on this, but also if there is something else you want to say.
Well, I think we've heard variations on this point before, but it's so important to have this partnering between these two communities that need to remain objective. The scientific community informing about the realities of what climate change is causing and the projections for it, and in the judiciary, this need to be better informed about the science, because these climate change cases are going to continue to be brought to the judiciary, and they are not by nature experts. Even though they will rely on expert testimony, they themselves have an opportunity to become better informed, because they are going to be go-to agents in this process of trying to do what's best to regulate, to address climate change. And so there was actually one case recently, I believe it was in the line of climate attribution cases in the US recently, that one judge just convened a hearing on climate science before the case actually proceeded. And it's very important for these two bodies to be mutually interdependent and open and receptive to one another, because science is not going to do anything without the regulators involved in advancing it, and likewise the regulators are not the experts on the science. So that communication is key, and there's a whole new field now about climate change communication that's evolved because of it.
Thank you very much, Randall. Cesar, I think that to me you're a very deliberate builder and encourager of epistemic communities. You must have some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what's been said about collaboration, and I would add a couple of notes based on those efforts that Siri is alluding to. So, for example, here at NYU, we're hosting what we call a community of practice of litigants, researchers in the social sciences, in the legal field, and also some natural scientists. So, for instance, one of the participants in this community is Rick Heady, whose calculations on carbon emissions were the basis for the Filipino complaint before the Human Rights Commission. And also at the Sabin Center at Columbia Law School, Mike Berger collaborates with a number of leading scientists precisely to try to hash out these very complex questions of attribution, causality that are crucial in legal cases. And the good news about this is that as important as the US and Australia and the UK contexts are, they are relatively exceptional when compared to the rest of the world in terms of the influence of the climate deniers and the whole bankrolling of quote-unquote experts to confuse the public and to put into question what even the most conservative estimates of the impact of climate change have shown. And so in most of the cases that I've studied, judges pay very, very close attention to scientists, and litigants know this very well. And I think there's even a greater respect for an appreciation of the role of scientists, and the fact that also scientists have become more open to publicly state how serious the current situation in the future will be if we go down the path of carbon emissions that we have now. And the fact that there's also more openness to not always speak about the most conservative estimate. There's this great book by Naomi Orestes and other scientists and historians of scientists showing how the minimum common denominator view has prevailed in many of the assessments on climate for good reasons, to hedge against political criticism and so on. But these days, what I see in the community of practice here that we hosted in NYU and many other places is that scientists are the ones who are most alarmed because they know the facts, and the ones who push litigants and even activists to say more and to move faster. So I would want to see more of that urgency based on science and collaboration, and I'm hopeful that that will continue to grow.
Thank you so much, Cesar. I think this was a very, very good closing to our session and to the Burgeoned Exchanges 2020. And of course, what Kiki was saying, the need to sort of develop, when you were saying, the need to develop language across that can bridge is something that is important also to the Burgeoned Exchanges. That's why we also try to bring together people from different disciplines around not only climate change, but also other issues that are both of scientific, but also urgent political importance. So thank you for that, Cesar. And thank you, Randall. Thank you, Kiki. Thank you, Jan. This has been a great pleasure.